And let's turn our Bibles to Ezekiel 38. Last time, as we were studying, we looked, of course, at those important chapters of 36 and 37, which talks about the reconstitution of the nation of Israel. As we saw the vision that Ezekiel had of the dry bones coming together. But now, having set that part aside, of course, that was the important first step there. Now in Ezekiel 38 and 39, most of you are probably familiar with it. It gives the details of what's referred to as the Ezekiel War. Now, it begins here in chapter 38 with giving a description of Gog's army. Now, Gog refers to a leader who's from Magog. And Magog, the name comes from the second son of Japheth, who was Noah's son. You know, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Magog was his second son. Now, Magog's likely the area on the eastern to northeastern area of the Black Sea. It's where the civilization referred to as the Scythians lived. And sometimes you'll read them referred to in the Bible. He's also described here, Gog is also described here as the prince of Rosh. Now, that should sound familiar because it seems to be an early version of the name Russia. So from there, we're beginning to see, we're going to have these people, as it says here at the beginning of 38, it says, now the word of the Lord came to me saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog. You know, set your face against, it's like you're pronouncing a judgment there and giving the details of it. Against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him. So, in that, so we see that we have Russia here. We also have Meshech and Tubal, which have been connected with the Russian cities of Moscow. Meshech, referring to Moscow, and Tobolsk for Tubal. Not everyone agrees on those labels, but I think they're helpful in seeing we're dealing with those areas that the peoples that are in these areas. And up here behind me, go to the other one, John. Can't read anything on there. There you go. That's better. You can see generally where these folks are. Tagarma is over there, but this doesn't show you all the way up to the top, but it'll be helpful when we get some of the other places here. And because this is what it's referring back to. When you see this, it's going back to the table of nations from Genesis chapter 10. And if you look at those and you look at what nations now exist where those people groups spread out to, you get a good understanding of what's taking place here. So, and then as we go down, Ezekiel is told to set his face against them, referring to Gog and his armies, and that God, as it says, we go down there, God was against them. He was setting himself against them, and we get a reason for that. God's going, as it describes here in verses 1 through 7, put a hook in their jaws and turn them around. The idea is, as we get to Daniel later, we'll see what was going on, because the picture is that Gog and his armies were headed back north after a different conquest, and God puts a hook in his jaw. Meaning, kind of like a fish hook, you put a hook in somebody's jaw, you can lead them around wherever you want. And so that's what God is doing. So he turns around. Also joining this army, as we go down here to verse 5, also joining this army is Persia, which is modern Iran, which is really interesting because Gog, Magog, and Rosh, obviously the Russians are leading here. Gog is the ruler of Russia. And so they're obviously leading here. And the interesting thing about Iran being involved is it's only been in the past several years that they even had a relationship between Russia and Iran. So once that happened, it's like, oh, look around. All these nations are lining up here. So we have them. We have Cush also here, which is, it's not showing Cush. It's a little bit further south of Egypt. It involves parts of Ethiopia and Sudan. That area, and obviously, most of the countries we're going to be pointing out here are Islamic countries. So we have them. We have Gomer, not Gomer Pyle, but Gomer. The folks that settled there, they settled in northern Turkey. You see them all the way up at the top there to the left. That's Gomer. They were in northern Turkey, but they also went up into Eastern Europe. So the people group is all in that area. And Togarmah is Eastern Turkey. You see Togarmah up there, Eastern Turkey, and also the area of Armenia today. We're dealing with those populations there. Now, so these nations, as I mentioned, are majority Muslim, and Russia is their chief arms supplier today. Interesting thing about this as well, Russia's army is something like, standing army is like 60% Muslim. So you have all of this going on. And then in verses 8 through 13, we see Gog's malice or his intentions here. It says, in the latter days, as it mentions here in 8, it says, well, let me read this one verse at least. It said, after many days, you will be visited in the latter days, in the latter years. You will come into the land of those brought back from the sword and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. They were brought out of the nations, and now all of them dwell safely. So this is giving you the political situation at the time of this invasion. Where we're looking right now in the present geopolitical situation, obviously they're not dwelling safely in the land at the moment. So something's going to happen to settle things down a bit. Even though all of these other nations are lined up, we could pick out a number of things could happen, like if Israel bombs Iraq or Iran, I mean. There's different geopolitical things that could go on that could calm things down for a while, and it says they're dwelling in safety. Another thing to say about the Ezekiel war is we're not exactly sure when it's going to happen. some of the stuff you can date within the tribulation period, but we don't know if this is going to happen before we're raptured, or after we're raptured, or at the beginning of the tribulation period. Those are kind of the options here. So we can't tell 100%, but we can look at it and see all of this stuff forming. So he's coming against those, of course, Israel, who's dwelling safely in the land. But he gets this idea to go against Israel with his army. It says to plunder and take booty. Plunder and take booty. The booty could be something, when you think about the present situation, you look at their Leviathan gas field out in the Mediterranean. In fact, the Russians don't like the idea that they have it because they're beginning to sell natural gas to Europe, to Greece and on into Europe. That upsets the Russians because they like to use, they have natural gas as well. And, some of those were blown up in the past couple of years. And people Europe starts looking more to Israel. And for a couple of reasons, Russia doesn't like that. One is, of course, they'd like to make money off of it. Two is, if they want to, they can use that as sort of a stranglehold on Europe to say, hey, you go along with us or we'll cut off your gas. So, they're kind of being circumvented to that way. So that could be one thing. They've also found oil in Golan, in the Golan Heights. So there's actually, they're developing oil. I used to think it was amazing for so many years, all of those countries all around Israel had oil. And they had none. But now, in recent years, they've discovered it. As I said, in Golan. It could also be, could be the minerals in the Dead Sea. Something in there they want. That place is so rich in minerals, you can find almost anything there. I thought it was interesting when you go into the Dead Sea and you're walking in there, you can reach down in the silt in the bottom and pull up a big salt rocks. Like as big as your fist. You reach down, pick them up out of and there's just so many minerals in the Dead Sea there. Now, Sheba and Dedan, which make up Saudi Arabia, and the merchants of Tarshish, I'll tell you who they could be in a minute, but they question Gog's actions, but they don't do anything about it. They say, why are you going to take booty? What exactly are you doing here? Now, as I said, Sheba and Dedan make up Saudi Arabia. Tarshish hasn't been completely, don't completely understand who it is. It's not on there because it's much further west. Remember, where was Jonah going when he was trying to run away from the Lord? He got on a ship in Joppa heading for Tarshish. Now, Tarshish was the furthest place you could go. It's like as far as you could go back then. And some commentators have said it's Spain. Others have said it's as far as England. So, it's kind of up that area of Western Europe, that part there. So they're complaining as well. Now in verses 14 through 23, we see where the conflict comes between God's plan and Gog's plan. God said he would bring Gog and his army against Israel, and they'll cover the land like a cloud. It's like There's so many people. Like I said, you're dealing with all these Islamic countries. You're dealing with Russia, and even I personally think, people try to look at the Muslim issue in Europe and everything as the big boogeyman that's going to take us all down and all that sort of thing. I don't believe so. I think this is going to be what takes place in Ezekiel 38 and 39 is going to be the solution to that problem. The reason I think that is because I think all these nations and all these Islamic people look at this with Russia as the opportunity to wipe Israel off the map like they've been saying they wanted to do for years, and they're all going to try. They're all going to come together at this point. So God says that he's going to bring Gog and his army against Israel. The purpose that God is doing this, as he said, God put his hook in his jaw. God's bringing them to Israel, but he's bringing them there for judgment, not for booty. And it says there specifically, the purpose is that the nations may know God and that he would be hallowed when he judges the nations in his righteousness as they come against Israel. So they'll be hallowed in the eyes of the world. He's hallowed because he is seen, this is all seen as the fulfillment of prophecy. And it's going to be such a mind blower that all of these people from all of these places come against Israel, and then they're all suddenly wiped out with no other explanation than it was God. That it was just God doing it. There's no explanations. They're not going to say, oh, we always knew Israel had nukes. They're not going to nuke their own land, So, so that's the picture there. Though he'll be hallowed because of this. He'll be considered holy because of this. God's going to demonstrate his fury first with a great earthquake, we're told here in verses 14 through 23. Great earthquake in Israel that's going to be felt around the world. That's how intense it's going to be, whether it's, simply that it registers around the world, or, it seems to me that they're talking about that it'll actually be felt around the world. And then God will cause these armies to fight against one another. He's going to rain hailstones on them, fire and brimstone. And again, people are always trying to look for natural explanations, saying it's nuclear warfare or some stuff like that. But nuclear warfare doesn't start earthquakes that are felt around the world. So he causes them to fight against one another. This will be a specific, clear act, so it's obvious that it was God doing it. So that's chapter 38. That's, in summary of what takes place during that. As it says in verse 23, the last verse of the chapter, though I think it's good to kind of sum it up, it says, thus I will magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations. Then they shall know that I am the Lord. Then they'll know who they're dealing with. Start to realize who they're dealing with. But again, as we see things prophetically, I know they'll stuff that again later. Now in chapter 39, we get more details. First of all, in verses 1 through 8, we get God's judgment of Gog and his army as God describes his judgment against Gog in very personal terms. He says he'll knock the bow out of Gog's left hand and his arrows out of his right hand. You get the picture of him just walking up to him and slapping it out of his hand and saying, chill, dude. They will be slain upon the mountains of Israel, and the birds and the beast will eat their carcasses. Get this picture here for he'll send fire upon the land of Magog itself and on the coastlands. Coastlands is another one of those expressions we're not really sure where it's referring to. Some have kind of postulated it could be the United States. It's, it's coastal areas, obviously. Some think islands. We don't know exactly, but he's saying he's going to turn against these other nations in judgment. Those nations who themselves thought they were dwelling securely and nobody could touch them. Now, what's especially obvious in this time is that nobody comes to Israel's aid. Not even America, not even the United States. And for what reason, we don't know at the moment, whether we're incapacitated in some way, whether the rapture took place and there's so many people are gone, the place we're too weak. You could say a number of things there, but we are just not sure. But it says here as well that God will make his name known in Israel so they no longer profane his name. In other words, they no longer go after idols. They no longer go after all these other things. They realize that God delivered them, so they begin to look to the Lord. And again, the nations will know exactly who is responsible for defending Israel. And that's the Holy One of Israel, as we're told here. It'll be perfectly clear. But it's amazing to me, as even after this, you see, as we'll discuss in a minute, other things coming up, like the rise of Europe and the Antichrist and things like that. It's like, okay, that happened. I go, how quickly people forget. We really do. We forget things very quickly. We are looking at immediate circumstances. So in verses 9 and 10, it speaks of Israel's victory. They'll be burning the weapons. Indication that a lot of them are made ultimately of wood. They even make some tanks out of wood. It's like a hard, really compressed wood. So they'll be burning the weapons for 7 years. They won't need to cut their trees down or anything for fires. They'll be using the weapons that they collected. So that statement there gives us a little bit of a time frame. They're going to be doing that for 7 years. Where does that relate to the tribulations? Is 7 years before that? So figuring out the timing, you try to figure the rapture in there too. Is that before the war, after the war, when that happens, when these 7 years take place? So in this way, Israel, as they were coming, these nations were coming to plunder Israel, and Israel ends up plundering them. How many times have we seen that? It's like another chapter in the same book. And then in verses 11 through 20, we have the description of Gog's burial and the armies as well. It says they're going to create a cemetery and call it Hammon Gog, which means the multitude of Gog. And it's actually from the location mentioned there, it's going to be where Moab used to be, on the east side of the Jordan River. The Israelis will be burying people for 7 months. And the way it describes it, they're going to have guys going around looking for bodies or remains somewhere, and they'll mark them with a flag or something, and somebody else will come along and pick them up and dispose of them or deal with them. So that's taking place for 7 months. And the hand of God is seen in the whole process. And there's actually, there's beginning to be spiritual fruit from Israel. And through this war, God deals with Russia. And as I said, resolves the problem of radical Islam, because there is no more. They are no more. And then in verses 21 through 29, he speaks of Israel being gathered together again. As it says, Israel will be fully gathered together, and later he will pour out his spirit upon them. Remembering, as we saw last time when we were in 36 and 37, is that Israel is gathered back now, but they're gathered back in unbelief. They don't believe. Many of them are atheists over there, secular. Most don't believe in the Messiah. So all of this stuff is going to gradually be building to the point where when they get midway through the tribulation period and the Antichrist sets himself up in the temple, and they're going to say, oh man, we hooked our wagon to the wrong horse. So after this, Israel's gathered back, and it's probably from the multitude of nations. I mean, there's still more Jewish people in the United States than there is in Israel. Probably more Jewish people in New York than there is in Israel. But at this point, it's going to become more and more obvious to them that they can't trust anybody, including the United States. Well, look at what's happening even now. In 1 week, you have a young couple that work for the Israeli embassy, who are both Messianic Jews, by the way, murdered. Then you had that nut in Boulder who was setting people on fire who were at a rally demonstrating for the return of the hostages. There's a spiritual sickness out there. Well, then that's what anti-Semitism is. I mean, when you have major American universities really supporting anti-Semitism, you see how deep the sickness goes. It's a spiritual thing. It truly is. So Israel continues to return to the land. And this is going to set, this whole event, this Ezekiel war is going to set the stage for the rise of Europe and the Antichrist at this point. Things are going to be in such a mess, they're going to look for somebody that's going to solve all their problems. And he'll stand up and say, here I am. Just let me do everything. Give me control of everything. Okay, sounds good to me. That's basically what happens. But you see it in Europe already setting up. I mean, when you have Have you ever seen pictures of the European Union's building in Brussels? It's shaped, it's designed like an incomplete ziggurat. The same thing that the Tower of Babel was. The symbol really in the courtyard there is, she's referred to her as Europa, but it's a woman riding a beast. Of course, that has prophetic symbolism there as well, and you see all this take. But it's wild. It's like they're actually looking forward to this now. Oh, we just need a guy to lead us, man. It's just they're pushing in that direction. And then, of course, as we go into the tribulation from there, and of course, as we just saw in 1 Thessalonians, the Antichrist can't be revealed yet until the church is taken out. So as soon as that happens, things change and we go into what's referred to as the 70th week of Daniel. What? That's it. Yep, you got it. You see that there? That's the place in Brussels. Oh, Strasbourg? I guess I had the wrong place. But artist's rendition of the Tower of Babel. That's what it was designed after. As you know, it talks about in Daniel chapter 9, the 70 weeks that were determined for the nation of Israel. 69 were fulfilled up until through the coming of Christ. And when he was cut off, as it says in Daniel 9, not for himself, meaning he was cut off for us, and dealt with the sin issue, there still remains 1 week or 1 7-year period for the nation of Israel. And so after the rapture of the church, God's focus then turns to Israel again for those years. That's one of the reasons for the tribulation, that 70th week. Of course, it's referred to also as the time of Jacob's trouble. It's also the time when God exercises his wrath on a Christ-rejecting world. That's why we're not going to be there, because as we read twice in 1 Thessalonians, God hasn't appointed us to wrath. He's not going to judge his own people. And so the Antichrist will help them rebuild the temple, but will profane it after 3.5 years. And at the end of the tribulation period, Jesus returns to set up the kingdom age, or his millennial reign. Now, this obviously wasn't in the text we're looking at here, but between 39 and 40, these are the events that take place. In chapter 40, we get, and really through the rest, we get a picture of the millennial reign, the temple. In fact, in verses 1 through 5, it discusses the new city during the millennium and the new temple. The rest of Ezekiel is taken up with this new city and this new temple, which goes from chapters 40 to 42. New worship in chapters 43 to 46. And then the new divisions of the land at that time, chapters 47 and 48. That's what the rest of Ezekiel is all about. And then we'll finish up on that next week, only going as far as 45 today. We're not going to give a lot of details as we go through here. I want to make some points, and and make a couple of applications, but a lot of this is reading measurements, and we all know how fun that is. But that's why we have this picture. And this is interesting to see the comparison here and what's taking place. This was, you see the little bitty thing over here is the tabernacle in the wilderness. Solomon's temple. Later, of course, when Zerubbabel came after the Babylonian captivity and started rebuilding the temple, he started rebuilding it, but it was later beautified, improved upon by Herod the Great, and it continued even after his death to be, restored even more. And it wasn't finished very many years before it was destroyed again in 70 AD. But that's Herod's. Then now you go over to this millennial temple, and you see how it compares. Another comparison down here is an American football field. So you can use that to compare how many would go in there. Probably a good 20 or so would go in there. 20 football fields. That's the size of just the temple itself. Interesting thing about this section as well, Ezekiel finished writing 38 and 39, and he wasn't given this last vision here until 13 years later. So there was a little bit of a gap there. This temple spoken of here, some people argue because they look at it, they look at the measurements and say, this doesn't make sense. It's too big for Jerusalem now. It doesn't match up any of the measurements of any of these other temples. And of course, since they can't figure it out, it must be spiritual. Or they try to make it allegorical or spiritual. Well, God doesn't have a single problem with making it. The indication here is he's going to adjust the topography. Remember when Jesus returns, when he returns and set his foot on the Mount of Olives, what's going to happen? It's going to split from east to west. And a stream's going to come flowing out of the mountain. And an interesting point is that there's already a fault line there from the rift that goes all the way down into Africa from there. But so this is going to be a literal temple during the millennium. It's set apart from others not only because of its size, but because of what's not in the temple. If you read there in chapter 40, you discover there's several things that aren't in the temple. There's no gold or silver mentioned being in the temple. No veil in the temple. No Ark of the Covenant in the temple. Because the Lord will be there himself. There's no need for an Ark of the Covenant. There's no need. Of course, the veil was torn in two before, so you might as well get that thing out of the way because we can go immediately into the presence of the Lord. So these are these important differences here. And Ezekiel is to declare to Israel, he's told here, all that he sees, giving them hope and vision. Because remember, when he's doing this, when he's declaring this, he's in Babylon. He's in the kingdom of Babylon at this time. So the people have been defeated by the Babylonians, are dejected. What are we going to do? We don't even have a country anymore. And Ezekiel is telling them at this point, just wait. Just wait. Well, you're going to see something. You're really going to see something. But the cool thing about it as well, though, as I talked about, walking there with the Lord, when you're in the presence of the Lord, you really don't need all of these other things to worship. When you realize, like Jesus said, where two or more are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst. You don't need candles. You don't need incense. You don't need people running up and down the aisles with streamers to feel like you're in the presence or to sense you're in the presence of God. All you simply have to do is realize you are. Is just realize that you are. In fact, the need for all these other things in order to worship is a demonstration that a person has lost their sensitivity to the reality of the presence of God. Now, in verses 6 through 16, it just starts to describes the eastern gate, and the gates on the outside of the temple. The eastern gate, of course, was the main gate. If you look at the modern Jerusalem, the eastern gate is the one that's closed. There was during the 500s, there was this one Muslim ruler. They had control of the area at that time. His name was Solomon the Magnificent. And he had this idea, if you close up the eastern gate and you put a Muslim cemetery out there, the Jewish Messiah can't come through. Duh. So he's kind of, well, wait a second. You're talking about somebody who rose from the dead, is now sitting at the right hand of the Father. He announced that he's coming to judge. You'd think he's going to have a hard time walking through a brick gate. So, now as well, the temple is arranged and situated from east to west. So the east gate is the natural main entrance. And we're given great detail here. But again, we're just getting measurements and pictures of palm trees and other things being around there. The outer court, which inside the temple here, this outer court, it was likely covered with a mosaic. Will likely be covered with a mosaic, and there's 30 rooms all around it. As you look around, and it gets to later what's in there. Then we get the north gate, which is, same description as the eastern gate, same with the south gate. But then you have gateways in the inner court. You have the outer court there. Inner court is immediately around the temple. So it has gateways in the south, east, and north. And the altar, you see right there, is in the middle of that court. Just like the altar, everyone needs to have an altar in the middle of their lives. That's why, of course, Paul writes in Romans chapter 12, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, because of the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable, which is your acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you might prove or live out what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. That's the picture. That's really the New Testament picture of an altar, is where we present ourselves to the Lord, surrendering to his purposes. And then in verses, and then we get a description in verses 38 through 43 of how the sacrifices are prepared. I'm not going to go in details in that. But these chambers around here are described in verses 46 and 47. There are some for the singers. They were also for those who served in the temple, and then for the priests who ministered to the Lord. And you see sort of this progression here where ministry really begins, any ministry really begins with ministering to the Lord first. What you receive from the Lord is what you are then able to impart to other people. As Paul described in 1 Corinthians 11:23 and 15:3, when he said, that which I received from the Lord, I also give to you. And we're also told in Acts 13:1 and 2, when it says, in describing the church in Antioch, it says, now in the church that was at Antioch, there were certain prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. Of course, Saul being Saul of Tarsus, who later became Paul. As they ministered to the Lord and fasted. Notice, they ministered to the Lord and fasted. The Holy Spirit said, now separate to me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. And this is when they went on their first missionary journey. Now, something important to see here is the importance, when we talk about worship, a lot of times we talk about it as if it was something for us, and I like this particular worship song or this kind of worship, or I don't like this kind, I really don't like that song, all of these sorts of things. And I like what I remember Malcolm Wild, the pastor of Calvary Chapel, Merritt Island, said one time, when he said a guy came up to him one time and said, boy, worship was really great today. And Malcolm looked at him and said, well, that's fine, but it's not for you. You see, the picture is worship, as we come in here, isn't a prelude to the sermon. Although it should prepare your heart for hearing from the Lord. But worship, as we come in here, and we sing, our attentions to be on the Lord. We're to be ministering to the Lord at that time. It's not a time to do anything else other than focus on the Lord, minister to the Lord in that sense. And then after this, we get in the end of chapter 40, we get the description of the outer court and the vestibule. 41, we just get the measurements of the temple. In Ezekiel 42, we get the chambers of the priest and the outer dimensions of the temple. And again, we're not going to go reading through a bunch of numbers. And 43, we get something really interesting happens here. You remember back in Ezekiel 11:23, that's when the presence of the Lord actually left the temple. And you know, there is never a time mentioned in Scripture where the presence of the Lord returned to the temple. Of course, the only time we could say that he did, but it wasn't to stay there, was when Jesus went into the temple. There, as I said, no record of the glory of God coming to the second temple or to the tribulation temple. The glory of the Lord will enter this temple in the millennium in the person of Jesus Christ when he comes through the eastern gate to rule and to reign and to receive worship. And he'll dwell with his people, we're told, forever. And then in the rest of that chapter, we get the dimensions of the altar. In chapter 44, we get some interesting statement here at the beginning of 44 in verses 1 through 3. He talks about there how the eastern gate going in is for the prince. The eastern gate of the outer court, though, is permanently shut when the Lord returns to the temple. Interesting. It's shut now over there. Certain people trying to keep Jesus out. But when Jesus enters the millennial temple, the gate's shut and never opened because he's not going anywhere. He's going to be there. He's going to dwell there with his people. And then in verses 4 through 9, it talks about those who are admitted to the temple, that there will be no idolatrous compromise as there had been in Israel in the past. And then you get the law concerning the priest. And then in chapter 45, which we'll end with, again, you get the measurements of the sanctuary district, the district of the prince in the city, the laws for the prince. And basically the laws for the prince was that he was to rule in justice and honesty. And you think, wait a second, there's a prince here ruling? Yeah, that seems to be the description, but with a couple of caveats, really. Two. You see, the prince couldn't be the Messiah that's being talked about here, because it talks about in chapter 46, verse 16, of him having sons. And in chapter 45, verse 22, it talks about him making a sin offering for himself. And obviously the Lord doesn't need to do that. So some have speculated, is it some descendant of David or something like that who officiates in the city as well? Don't know. Speculation. So they will as well, as we close here, what they'll be doing, and it mentions certain feast, and they'll be continuing to do the feast as a memorial. Just like the sacrifices will be memorial, like we do communion today. It's a memorial. We're not literally sacrificing the body and the blood again and again and again. It's not a perpetual sacrifice. Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me. If he was there, you wouldn't have to remember. If he was involved in it, you wouldn't have to remember. But he says, do this in remembrance of me. And in the same way, they'll be celebrating certain feasts. And in the celebration of them, there'll be the acknowledgement that he was the fulfillment of all of them. And that's why they still do them. Because it's really a recognition of the finished work of Christ and the celebration of the feast. So let's pray. Father, again, we thank you so much for your word, and just, Lord, all of the details we have so far ahead of knowing that, knowing what you're going to accomplish in this world and for the nation of Israel, Father, on into the millennium. So, Lord, help us in the times we're living in, Lord, not to be blown away by the things going on around us, but to simply recognize that you're working out your plan. And as you said, to occupy or be doing your business until you come, Lord. So work in our hearts and our lives, Lord. And may the way we live our lives today glorify you, Lord, as we've repeatedly read tonight, and as Ezekiel repeatedly says, or records you saying, that the people will know that you're the Lord. And in the New Testament way of saying that, when the disciples were before the Sanhedrin, it says that they took note that they had been with Jesus. Lord, may that be true of us as well. We thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.